Hi there. So this is Bhante Vendrakita Samanera, also known as Brother Ben. So once again, thank you once more to Dr. Todd Grande, from which this material has been sourced on his video. And I would like to repeat again, I'm not a qualified licensed counselor, therapist. I'm a Buddhist monk in training. What I want to do today is to have a look at some personality disorders, refamiliarize ourselves with the different types of personality disorders. There are 10 basic, and they're in 3 clusters. So cluster A is suspicious, the paranoid personality disorder, very distrustful of others and suspicious of their motives and tending to hold grudges. Schizoid, who tend to display little interest in forming personal relationships or partaking in social interactions. Usually don't pick up on normal social cues. May seem emotionally cold. Schizotypal. In schizotypal, people believe they can influence other people or events with their thoughts. They often misinterpret behaviors, causing them to have inappropriate emotional responses and consistently avoid having intimate relationships. Cluster B, moving on, emotional and impulsive cluster, antisocial personality disorder, and these people tend to manipulate or treat others harshly without expressing remorse for their actions, and they may lie, steal, or abuse alcohol or drugs. Borderline personality disorder, and people with this type of disorder tend to feel empty and abandoned, regardless of family or community support. They may have difficulty dealing with stressful events. They may have episodes of paranoia. They also tend to engage in risky and impulsive behavior, such as unsafe sex or binge drinking and gambling. Next is histrionic personality disorder. These people frequently try to gain more attention by being more overly dramatic or sexually provocative. They are easily influenced by other people and are extremely sensitive to criticism or disapproval. Next is the narcissistic personality disorder. These people tend to believe they are more important than others. They tend to exaggerate their achievements and may brag about their attractiveness or success. They may have a deep need for admiration but lack empathy for other people. And on to cluster C, the anxious group. So this includes avoidant personality disorder. People with this type of disorder often experience feelings of inadequacy, inferiority, or unattractiveness. They usually dwell on criticism from others and avoid participating in new activities or making new friends. And then we have the dependent personality disorder. These people heavily depend on other people to meet their emotional and physical needs. They usually avoid being alone. They regularly need reassurance when making decisions, and they may also be likely to tolerate physical and verbal abuse. And lastly, obsessive compulsive personality disorder. People with obsessive compulsive personality disorder have an overwhelming need for order. They strongly adhere to rules and regulations. They feel extremely uncomfortable when perfection isn't achieved, and they may even neglect personal relationships to focus on making a project perfect. What is OCPD, the last one there, the personality disorder, and how is it different to NPD? We're going to go on and have a look at that. But first of all, let's have a closer look at obsessive compulsive personality disorder. Let's focus in on that one, which we're going to refer to as OCPD. Now in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual as a cluster C personality disorder, the anxious, fearful cluster. The other 2 personality disorders in cluster C, as I said, are avoidant personality disorder and dependent personality disorder. And OCPD is often confused with obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD. So there's high comorbidity between these 2 disorders. That means the simultaneous presence of both of them to chronic diseases or conditions in a person. So if somebody has OCD, Obsessive Compulsive Disorder, there is a 25% chance they would also qualify for a diagnosis of Obsessive Compulsive Personality Disorder, OCPD. However, they are distinct mental health disorders, and there's a number of key differences to differentiate them. Probably the one that stands out the most is that OCPD doesn't have obsessions or compulsions. Just to clarify, obsessions are an idea or a thought that continually preoccupies or intrudes on a person's mind. Compulsions are an irresistible urge to behave in a certain way, especially against one's conscious wishes. And we also see a lack of insight with OCPD more often than we do with OCD. Perfectionism is a key characteristic we see in OCPD. We don't always see that in OCD. So I'm going to go over the symptom criteria we see in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and then some of the other features that people tend to notice with this disorder. So looking at the symptom criteria in the DSM, there are symptoms that we often see with OCPD. The first is a preoccupation with details, order, schedules, and lists. And the second is that perfectionism interferes with task completion. We also see an excessive devotion to productivity. We also see over-conscientiousness. So somebody's inflexible when it comes to ethics, inflexible when it comes to morality, and inflexible when it comes to values. And this isn't accounted for by cultural differences. We see a difficulty in discarding objects that are worthless or at the end of their useful life, mostly because there's a fear that they could be useful in the future. We see a reluctance to delegate tasks, a miserly spending style, and rigidity. Now, there's not a lot of good information on the prevalence of OCPD in the general population. It's believed to be somewhere between 2 and 8%, and it's also believed that it is one of the more prevalent personality disorders. It tends to affect males to females at a rate of about 2 to 1. Now, when it comes to OCPD and limitations in functioning, when we think of other personality disorders, we usually see a clear connection with the behaviors, the thoughts, and emotions with impairment. For example, in borderline personality disorder, we see the love-hate cycle. In borderline PD, we tend to see that there are the disregard for society's rules that we see also in antisocial personality disorder. With OCPD, the maladaptive portion is a little less clear. One of the reasons perhaps for this is that society tends to value career productivity, and a lot of the characteristics associated with OCPD are actually favorably looked on by a number of employers. For example, being organized, having a tendency toward perfectionism, being meticulous and even emotionally restricted. That emotional restriction we see with OCPD is favored in a lot of work environments. Some other OCPD traits that would be seen as favorable by employers would be a decreased interest in leisure, not taking vacations or not taking them very often. Usually an extreme loyalty to the company's values, and respecting authority. Individuals with OCPD are often punctual, they use grammar very well, they have a formal language style, they tend to be serious, and they don't tend to take chances in relationships. So, for example, they'd be much less likely to be involved in workplace harassment. There are, of course, some downsides when it comes to some of the characteristics we see with OCPD and the workplace. Individuals of this disorder are more likely to poorly express themselves with their body language. so their body language can be misinterpreted. And those restricted emotions, which can at times be an asset, can also be a hindrance in terms of the social climate of a workplace. Also, individuals with OCPD are more likely to be sensitive to criticism, dislike ambiguity and uncertainty, dislike new ideas, lack creativity and imagination, and tend not to have many fantasies. Also, they tend to lack empathy. And lacking empathy in particular is usually frowned upon in social situations. Also, individuals with OCPD tend to be condescending or look down on individuals who are overly expressive with emotions. For example, if somebody was high on the extroversion trait, they would look at this as immature or irresponsible. And they also tend to dislike individuals who are impulsive. In terms of a home or family life, some of the characteristics that could affect that would be difficulty expressing affection, love and tenderness. That's fairly common with OCPD, and also an inability to relax. A number of times when we see individuals with OCPD come into treatment, it's because somebody from their family has had enough of the perfectionism and the dedication to work, and they want more of a commitment to family life. Usually it's not because of some problem at work, although sometimes of course it is. Some important points. When it comes to comorbidity, we mentioned there's comorbidity between OCD and OCPD. But if you look at the comorbidity with obsessive compulsive disorder, an individual with that disorder, OCD, is actually more likely to have comorbid avoidant personality disorder or dependent personality disorder than OCPD. Now, comorbidity with OCPD in terms of other personality disorders, we see high comorbidity with avoidant personality disorder, borderline, histrionic, paranoid, and narcissistic personality disorders. Now, in terms of treatment, individuals with this disorder are usually reluctant to go into treatment. This is considered a common problem with OCPD. When somebody does come into treatment, some of the techniques that have been shown to be somewhat effective would be working on problem solving, like for example cognitive behavioral therapy, time management, and trying to increase empathy. So I hope that's been useful. I took this information from Dr. Todd Grande's video on this subject, and I hope that's been useful. Please take a look at my next video, which is the difference between narcissistic and obsessive compulsive personality disorder. OCPD is obsessive compulsive personality disorder, and how is it different to narcissistic personality disorder? So this is a good question, and a lot of times these two disorders are confused with one another, NPD and OCPD. When we look at the symptom criteria, it's not really clear why they are confused so much. So let's take a look at the symptom criteria first when looking at narcissistic personality disorder. So we sometimes see grandiosity, or a desire to have unlimited power or success, a sense that one is special and should be treated as such, a need for excessive admiration, a sense of entitlement, someone who exploits, who lacks empathy. There's a lot of envy, and there's a lot of arrogance. Now, when we compare these symptoms to the symptoms we see with OCPD, Obsessive Compulsive Personality Disorder, they are quite a bit different. So with OCPD, we see a preoccupation with details, order, schedules, lists, perfectionism to the point where it interferes with completing tasks, and excessive devotion to productivity. being overly cautious, so being inflexible in the area of ethics, morals, or values, being hesitant to discard objects that have no value, having difficulty delegating tasks, adopting a miserly spending style, and this would be with other people and with themselves, and being rigid or stubborn. So we look at these two sets of symptom criteria. As mentioned, it seems like they are fairly distinct. So why is it these two personality disorders are oftentimes confused? So Dr. Grande says he believes that there are a variety of reasons why these two disorders become confused with one another. And a lot of it has to do with perception. And some of the characteristics are really disorders, but for different reasons. And the expression of the characteristic is a little bit different between the two disorders. So the first reason has to do with the perception of being supercilious, that's haughty, behaving or looking as though someone thinks one is superior to others. Haughty, conceited, disdainful, overbearing, pompous, condescending, superior, patronizing, proud, lordly or snobbish. Now with narcissistic personality disorder, this is what somebody is trying to achieve. They're trying to appear superior. With OCPD, this is really just a byproduct of the behavior. Individuals with OCPD have a real commitment to perfectionism. And sometimes this is interpreted as being supercilious, as being conceited or condescending. The next reason is lack of empathy. With both disorders, we do see a lack of empathy, but for different reasons. With NPD, Narcissistic Personality Disorder, we believe that an individual with this disorder usually does have the ability to empathize. And my own personal note here, a little apology interjection about mirror neurons. I did say that there's, with NPD, faulty mirror neurons. That looks like that was bad intel. So please disregard that. So with NPD, we believe they do have the ability to empathize, but they don't use that ability. Now with OCPD, the same thing is true, but the way we usually think about OCPD is that somebody has the ability to empathize, just like with NPD, and they choose to empathize, they're just not very good at it. Oftentimes with OCPD, we see that individuals with this disorder have difficulty expressing themselves with body language, and sometimes this can be interpreted as not having empathy. So it's again more about perception, other people's perception. Just like what we see with arrogance and superciliousness, then it is actually about being a characteristic of the disorder. Another reason these two disorders are confused is because we see a lack of generosity in both of these disorders. Now with NPD, that lack of generosity is with other people. Usually somebody with narcissistic personality disorder will indulge themselves. They will spend money on themselves, they will treat themselves, but not so with other people. With OCPD, it's more of a global effect. Somebody with OCPD would not spend money on others, and also they would not spend money on themselves. So again, we see the same characteristic, but it has a different feel to it, with one disorder as opposed to the other. Another reason we see for the confusion is the condescending attitude that we see sometimes we see with NPD and sometimes with OCPD. Now, this condescending attitude can have the same feel with both of these disorders, but with NPD, it is more globalized. So somebody with narcissistic personality disorder will be condescending to a variety of people, regardless of the other people's personality traits. And this will happen regularly. This is a core trait of NPD. This condescending attitude with OCPD, we don't think of it as regular, but more specific to certain situations. So we can see it sometimes and not others, and it's specific to certain types of people. In most cases, an individual with OCPD will have more of a condescending attitude with people that they determine as immature, irresponsible, or impulsive. So typically we think of this as individuals who are low in conscientiousness. That would be the impulsive part. Or high in extroversion. That would be somebody who's overly expressive with emotions. So individuals tend to dislike or sometimes tend to be condescending towards people who have those personality traits, but not necessarily people with other personality traits. Individuals with OCPD are actually quite respectful to figures of authority, for example. The next reason for the confusion with these two disorders is the commitment to perfectionism. And with NPD, we see this expressed as an individual who really believes they have achieved perfection. Now with OCPD, we see this more as a journey. Somebody is trying to obtain perfectionism. But actually, people with OCPD are quite self-critical. They do not believe they have achieved perfection. Another point of confusion with these disorders is the referral source, like who's referring that person in for treatment. A lot of times we think of NPD and OCPD as having similar sets of reasons for why people come into treatment, not so much because they believe something is wrong and they want to change something, but rather because a family member, co-worker, friend, or romantic interest has pressured them into seeking treatment. So this is a thread that ties NPD and OCPD together. This is a similarity. Now the last similarity covered here, the last reason for the confusion between these two disorders is the level of productivity we see in the work environment. When we look at all the personality disorders, it's not unusual to think of obsessive compulsive personality and narcissistic personality disorder as the two that are the most associated with being productive at work. It could be said that probably OCPD is thought of as number one in terms of productivity, and NPD would probably be number two. Now, of course, other personality disorders can be associated with career success as well, just not to the extent we usually see with OCPD and NPD. Now, the reason for the work productivity, or the perception of being productive at work, is different for both of these. With NPD, we usually think of it as an abundance of confidence. Some of this disorder is usually quite self-assured, and sometimes this translates into people believing they're productive, or into actual productivity with OCPD. It's more of the dedication to perfectionism, like orderliness, being meticulous, detail-oriented, and liking organization in general. These are characteristics that a lot of employers favor. And a lot of times an individual with this disorder can be highly productive at tasks, particularly those that demand an orientation towards details and do not tend to tolerate mistakes very well. So careers that demand precision. So again, with both, we see productivity at work, probably more so with OCPD, but this is a similarity between these two disorders. So once again, thank you once more to Dr. Todd Grande, from which this material has been sourced on his video. And I would like to repeat again, I'm not a qualified counselor, licensed counselor, therapist, or so on. I'm a Buddhist monk in training. And thank you for watching. Don't forget to leave a comment, like and subscribe, and I look forward to sharing more information about psychotherapy, therapy, counseling, and personalities. Take care and may many beings be free from avoidable suffering.